In the tradition of Ryan's recent gentle rant called "Beware All Rectangles," I have decided to compose an answer where I explore some similar topics from my own perspective of understanding. And I think as we proceed together, we may learn to put a bit of the fear into these rectangles. But before we begin, I'd like to issue this gentle warning. In this video, we are going to use rectangles to question rectangles and to defy other rectangles. And in fact, I think we're going to have a kind of tangled path here, but given a little insight and inspiration, I think we'll find our way to an interesting position somewhere within. Hypnosis is effectively what we might call a non-ordinary state, in that although we can commonly experience forms of trance in our everyday lives, to be actually hypnotized in the specific meaning of the term is to be placed into a deep sense of imaginative awareness. This is often accomplished by visual focuses like the one illustrated here. Traditionally, the spinning spiral has been a tool used by older hypnotists to help induce trance, and this is done by a process of visual attenuation, where the subject focuses on a specific object for a long period of time, and that focus by itself tends to help to induce trance. The other aspect of sensing that is often used to induce trance is an auditory sense, the sense of the music of a person's voice, the rhythm of their language, and also the tonality. So hypnotism is itself something we do. To be hypnotized is to be in a hypnotic trance. Normally this has a fairly narrow definition that lies within standard hypnotic procedure and containers. However, there are, I think, other similar forms of trance that we experience pretty commonly. Sometimes when we are driving, we may actually kind of forget the travel between the two places, which indicates a sort of trance. And I have a fairly radical belief myself, which is that what we call waking awareness is actually largely, for most of us, trance-like most of the time. So we awaken from sleep and begin immediately entering a trance-like state, composed of habits and language, ideas, paradigmatic ways of viewing ourselves, the world, our history, experience, things like this. And I think that my theory, which may be very naive, is that when we experience hypnosis, we're just sort of redirecting a trance which is already pretty much in place. The trance of our waking consciousness, or the various streams of trance therein. And we would perhaps contrast the experience of being hypnotized, which is often a very relaxing experience, with the idea of meditation, in which, in most traditions, the practitioner is encouraged not to enter trance, or to endeavor not to enter trance. That is, to remain awake and aware and perhaps continue deepening that awakeness and awareness. This practice ordinarily involves allowing the mind to become very settled, not to follow thoughts, and a deep sense of the feelings of our senses, our body, our skin, breathing particularly. And so this symbol, which is not necessarily an induction device, is indicative of the mind of, for example, Zen meditation. Very graceful, very natural, kind of a living circle, open to the world. Not just leading to its core, but open to the world of living things, in fact. So we've seen two symbols now, one associated with hypnotic induction and one associated with insight and awareness. We then come to this symbol, the rectangle, which I think Ryan has offered as a kind of induction key, something that invites us into trance that is ubiquitous everywhere in our culture. For example, at the moment I'm sitting in a rectangular room with two rectangular screens. One of them is my computer on which I am recording this. I'm sitting at a rectangular desk. Almost all of the art on my walls is rectangular, all of my books are rectangular, my money is rectangular, my writing pads are rectangular, videotapes and video games are rectangular. The list goes on. We go down to a store, they put things in little rectangles to sell them to us, they put those in rectangular bags. We walk out of the rectangle where we bought the rectangles with a bag full of rectangles. It's pretty ubiquitous. It's perhaps the most significant single shape in our culture, and Ryan's implication that this is an induction device, that this is an invitation to a particular set of kinds of trances, is extremely provocative and hard to ignore, considering the ubiquity of this shape in our cultural experience. And so he, I think, and I are both aware that this frame, if you will, which authorizes and sort of credentials whatever appears within it, is in fact an invitation to, at the very least, attention, if not a kind of trance. And since we've been watching trances like television programs, advertisements, movies and such, on these rectangles, in fact even theater occurs usually on a rectangular stage, we can, it's not such a stretch to imagine that this shape is an induction trigger, at least in our culture at least, but in many cultures quite obviously. And often this message that is coming through is really the propaganda of that culture and its sub-factions. And so, you know, we use the internet on rectangles, our browsers are rectangular, the little boxes we post in are rectangles, emails are often usually rectangular. The ubiquity of this one shape is pretty astonishing. Now, if you were to leave culture entirely, if you were to break your bonds with this culture all the way and just go back to living outside, for example, you would immediately become viscerally aware of other windows of induction. And part of the problem here is that I want to point out is that the extreme pervasiveness of the rectangle is replacing something. This induction window is replacing something far more exciting and momentous than anything delivered within, and by our rectangles. And were you to break your bonds with culture and go become wild, and I don't just mean go camping, although even in that experience, I think some of the other induction windows will become available, you would immediately discover what was being replaced. You would experience entrance instead of being in trance. And what you would be entering would be an experience of the natural human animal and your relationship with the environment. I think it's also important, before I go on to show some of the induction windows that have been replaced by the rectangle, is just to mention these two words, transmission. This actually a word when we use it to indicate the exchange of meaningful information or content. We're acknowledging that meaningful information and content, the experience of exchanging it, comprises a form of trance. And this is similarly implied when we use the word transformation. To transform something requires and naturally elicits a form of trance. We've forgotten this for at least two very important reasons. The first is that the trances that are induced by the rectangles rarely acquire the momentous prodigy of the natural trances that we might enter in other contexts and with other induction windows. So what I'm getting at here is that the rectangle delivers peculiar forms of content that induce a peculiar kind of trance. Our natural ability to enter trance is shockingly broader than anything the rectangle can induce, and generally happens only with each other or in deep, intimate contact with nature. And the second reason, which I left out there, was specifically that in our isolation from nature within our cultures, we commonly don't have experiences of the kind of trance that I'm speaking of, which is effectively a sort of an experience of being in a flow of learning that is electrically charged with meaning and transformation. This often happens to us when we're in intimate contact with nature. It rarely happens through the auspices of the rectangle, including even now. So what trance windows am I talking about that the rectangle is replacing? Well, the most obvious of them is the forest. This is actually the place where I left culture myself, and you'll notice that there's a lot of interesting things in this picture. There's a large building that says hotel on it, and there's flowing water, a river. It's actually the Russian River in California, and there's a big stand of trees right behind it, which is some relatively wild terrain back there that leads toward Bohemian Grove. That's where I left culture, and that's where I discovered things like the sun and the kind of relationship that one has with this throughout the day when living outdoors, beyond culture and beyond the grip of most of the rectangles. This is a fundamental element in one's daily experience. Not only that, but the specific activity of light upon water is one of the most trance-inducing visual experiences I've ever encountered. It is consistently mind-blowing when one is paying close attention to it. And of course, then at night, the other obvious window is the moon, which goes through phases that mark time. It's not very easy to mark time by the sun, unless you're familiar with a calendar, but with the moon you could learn to mark time very accurately due to its phases. And the influence of the moon and the sun on our cognition and the state of our awareness is so profound that it's difficult to quantify, but it's one of the things that gets immediately lost when we're immersed in culture, particularly the culture of the rectangles. Of course, as I mentioned previously, light on water, the way that light plays upon water, is a deeply trance-inducing experience to behold. And it's quite astonishing because there are rhythmic pulses in the way this often happens on water that with long enough exposure can become a somatic feeling sort of in your belly, where it's almost as if your insides begin to dance with the rhythm of the changing dappled light on the water surface. Now, of course, perhaps the most deeply trance-inducing window is the most obvious one, which we've often seen used in probably old movies about hypnotism: the eyes of living beings. Now, of course, we're mostly familiar with looking deeply into the eyes of other humans, but I also mean the eyes of many animals. So I think these windows are perhaps the most profound of all the living windows that invite us into, again, a kind of unbelievably profound way of learning that has little to do with gathering tokenized information and a lot to do with being immersed in sensing and in relation with place, moment, context, another being. Like this one, like you, like me. Particularly, I find this to be true of animals and even insects. Orion also spoke briefly about the power of a small creature to affect a large enemy. And this is one of my favorite creatures that is an example of that. This is a Pseudocreobotrys wahlbergi, or possibly a Pseudocreobotrys ocellata, a flower mantis native to Ghana. This insect is approximately 1.25 inches in length. It's very tiny. And I once saw one of these insects knock a man down and backward 4 feet simply by ejecting a small droplet of water from the tip of its abdomen directly into his pupil at a range of about 5 feet from me. So this creature, while sitting on my finger, took out a 5'7", 145-pound man with a droplet of water about the size of a pinhead. Through some motion of its abdomen, it directed that tiny droplet of water into his pupil, and he flew backwards as though he had been shot by a bullet and landed on his back. This would be like if you yelled at the Transamerica Pyramid and it leapt across the San Francisco Bay and landed in Oakland. So it seems that focus is a lot more important, in some cases anyway, than numbers. And of course skill matters, but this creature is acting, I think, to a large degree by what we would call instinct. I don't believe that that allows us to write it off as mechanical. I think it's a form of innate prodigy. And a creature like this is constantly in the learning trance that I was speaking of before, the kind of natural trance of being completely immersed in a non-rectangular environment, in a living context, where everything matters. With one of these beings, he climbed on its finger, me. With another of these beings, he knocked it down with a tiny droplet of water. The other gentleman who was there, he didn't attack me, he only attacked him. He knew which one to attack, even though he doesn't really get into rectangles or language or books or anything. This being knew the difference between an ally and a foe, and had no problem dealing adeptly with its really quite magnificent foe. Of course, that man could have gotten up and, been offended and tried to kill this creature, in which case I might have defended it, but that's another hypothesis. I think the main point is that in our natural state, in the trance of learning, we have access to inherent forms of prodigy that are denied us by the rectangle and our relationship with it. Some of these forms of prodigy involve learning, some of them involve relation, some of them involve problem solving. There are a wide array of assets that we're carrying that really only activate when we're deeply engaged in the learning trance. And I think this is part of why as teens we become adventurous, is because we're expecting to be initiated into the path of the learning trance, but there are no such really such vectors in our culture, so we end up with drug abuse, sexual adventurism, behavioral adventurism, some substitutes that really, I feel, are tragically inferior to the natural assets and capacities that would easily be activated if only there were a context to do so. The finest context for that to happen in is nature, with plants and animals, outside the world of clocks and screens and books and written language. And I think when we deeply enter nature, in a sense, we are experiencing a kind of meditation that will bring us within ourselves more deeply. We follow nature into new possibilities within ourselves. And these possibilities, many of them can only be awakened in contexts that are largely unfamiliar to us in our modern cultures, with our dependence and addictions to technologies. Few of us would realize that because we just don't have the direct experience of it, that nature is itself a learning universe, and so everything within it is in this kind of fire of learning trance. And thus the closer that we are to that, the more we kind of naturally follow along with its tempo, its character, its prodigy, its rhythm, its creativity, its fertility, its tragedy, its courage, its power. I will probably talk more about this learning trance and how we might have a chance to enter it together, for we certainly can call each other into it in contexts that allow us to be a little more of ourselves than the academic and professional contexts that we ordinarily obey do. Of course, the other wonderful trance-generating window is the sky, particularly at night. And unfortunately as well, in our cultures, light pollution often blocks or even silences this window. One more way in which our immersion in culture takes away the natural windows of learning trance and replaces them with framed constructs, tokenizations, reductions, models, the message of the culture. That's not the whole story, though. There are many profoundly beautiful uses of the rectangle. But if we are not clearly aware of how pervasive and powerful the frame can be, then perhaps we are too easily swayed by the spin contained therein. with this knowledge we've shared here, I think we might just have the chance to scare the rectangles together. And that's my gentle rant. Wise dreams to you.